I had just finished slicing the bread when I heard their car pull up. Same time every Thursday, except they were always 10 minutes late. I glanced at the oven clock, wiped my hands on the dish towel, and adjusted the stack of plates on the sideboard. Roast chicken, steamed squash, and a pot of long grain rice, nothing fancy, just warm and filling. The door opened without a knock, as usual. Clara's heels clicked against the tile, while Ethan trailed behind, still scrolling on his phone. "Smells good, Mom," he said, not looking up. Clara gave me a quick hug that barely grazed my shoulder. I smiled anyway. "Wash your hands," I said gently. "Food's ready in 5. They talked as I moved around the kitchen, about traffic, about Clara's work drama, about a neighbor's dog barking too much. The kind of chatter that filled time without asking much in return. I set the table as they settled in, folding the napkins I'd ironed the day before, lining up the forks, even though I knew no one else noticed. It was just as I placed the pitcher of water down that Ethan cleared his throat. "Hey, so Clara and I were talking," he said, scooping rice onto his plate. "Starting next month, we'll just transfer all your deposits into my account. You don't need to manage it anymore." I looked up, unsure if I'd misheard. "You know," Clara added, "so you don't have to stress about it. You've done enough. It's just easier this way." Ethan nodded. "It's not like you need much these days anyway." The knife in my hand hovered over the chicken. I felt the weight of it cool, solid. I wasn't sure what part of me froze, first my hand, my throat, or my heart, but I didn't say anything. I carved the breast cleanly, placed it on Ethan's plate, and then Clara's. Then I smiled and said, "Dinner's ready." The next Thursday, I unplugged the television. Once I started paying attention, I couldn't stop. Their visits followed a rhythm so predictable, it felt rehearsed. Ethan and Clara arrived late, always hungry, always talking over each other, as if the space existed only to receive their voices. They sat, they ate, they filled the air with complaints and plans and stories that never included me except as a background detail. I refilled glasses. I passed the salt. I listened. They never asked how my week had been. Not once did either of them look at my hands, still rough from years of work, or notice the new ache in my shoulder that made sleeping difficult. If I mentioned something small, my car making a strange sound, the pharmacy raising prices again, it slid right past them, uncollected. When they were finished, Ethan leaned back content. Clara checked her phone. Plates stayed where they were. The sink waited. They always left in a hurry. "Long week," Ethan would say. Or, "Early meeting tomorrow." The door closed behind them, and the house settled into silence that felt heavier than before they arrived. I washed the dishes alone, watching the water run cloudy, wondering when I had stopped being part of the conversation in my own home. I told myself this was normal, that grown children were busy, that gratitude didn't always look like thank yous. But the truth kept nudging its way forward, quiet and persistent. I was no longer seen as a person. I was a routine, a convenience, a place to eat. The following Thursday, they came again. Same entrance, same talk, same empty hands. When Ethan reached for the remote after dinner, his fingers brushed plastic and stopped. "Huh," he said. "Did the TV break?" I glanced up from the sink. I unplugged it. "Why?" Clara asked. "I wasn't using it," I said, and went back to washing plates. No one questioned it. No one cared. They finished their drinks, gathered their coats, and left without noticing that something in the house and in me had already begun to shift, because the quiet that followed felt less like absence and more like space. Ethan came on Monday instead of Thursday. That alone unsettled me. He stood in the doorway holding a thin folder, his jacket still on, as if he didn't plan to stay long. "Got a minute?" he asked. I stepped aside and let him in. Clara followed, already scanning the room, her eyes pausing on the bare wall where the television had been. No comment, just a look. They sat at the table. Ethan slid the folder toward me and opened it with careful fingers. "It's nothing complicated," he said. "Just some paperwork to make things smoother." I looked down. Forms, authorization pages. My name typed neatly at the top. "You forget things sometimes, Mom," he added, not meeting my eyes. "It's not safe for you to be alone with so many numbers. This way nothing gets missed." I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Clara leaned in, resting her elbows on the table. "You raised a responsible man," she said, her voice soft, almost kind. "Let him take care of you now." I turned the pages slowly. Each one gave him more access, more control. There was a pen clipped to the folder, placed there with intention. "I'd like some time," I said. Ethan frowned. "Time for what to read?" I replied. "To think." He exhaled sharply. "Mom, this is standard. Everyone does this." "Still," I said, "I want a few days." The irritation flickered across his face before he smoothed it away. Clara's smile thinned, but she nodded. "Of course," she said. "Take your time." They left soon after, the folder staying behind as if it had already been decided. I carried it to my bedroom and set it on the dresser unopened, now suddenly heavier than paper should be. That night I didn't sleep. I lay listening to the house settle, every creak sounding louder than usual. Sometime after midnight, I got up and crossed the room to the low dresser near the window. The bottom drawer resisted before sliding open. Inside was the small metal lockbox I hadn't touched in years. I set it on the bed, turned the key, and lifted the lid, all ready, sensing that whatever waited inside would change what came next. The lockbox held more than I remembered. Old tax returns, a copy of the deed, 2 letters from the bank with my name spelled wrong, and a worn notebook with scribbled figures from a time when everything had to be tracked by hand. I pulled out the notebook, set it aside, and turned on the small desk lamp in the corner. Then I reached for my laptop. The bank's website loaded slowly. I entered my login hand steady. I hadn't checked in a while. I paid bills on schedule, lived simply, and didn't spend beyond what I needed. There was never a reason to worry. Until now. I scanned the transactions. My fingers paused on a line near the middle. $200. Transferred out. The note beside it read, "Family emergency." I stared at it, letting the words sink in. I hadn't transferred that money. I hadn't authorized anything like it. The date matched the week Ethan and Clara were in Florida. I remembered because they'd skipped dinner, texting a photo of a beach and nothing else. I clicked further and found something worse. A new account had been created under my profile, joint access. Opened 2 months ago. I knew nothing about it. My heart beat harder. I opened another tab and checked the credit bureau's website. There it was. A credit card application filed in my name the previous week. I leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't about convenience or safety or helping. This was a plan. A quiet, careful plan that had started long before that folder landed on my table. I reached for the printer-loaded paper and began printing everything. Statements, screenshots, account details. I filed each page into a manila envelope and wrote the word January across the front in thick black ink. Then I set it beside the lockbox, turned off the lamp, and sat for a long time without moving. The next morning, I called the credit union. While the printer cooled and the envelope sat on the desk, my mind drifted somewhere I hadn't planned to go. I was back in the old apartment, standing on a chair by the window, pinning up heavy curtains I'd sewn myself. The fabric was too thick for summer, but it was what I had. My fingers ached from hours at the machine, the needle humming late into the night. Upstairs, Ethan's voice cut through the ceiling, sharp and excited, as he shouted at a video game. I remember smiling, despite the noise, telling myself it was a good soundproof That he was safe, distracted young. Let him be a child a little longer, I'd thought. He's been through enough. That sentence had followed me for years, quietly justifying things I should have questioned. Extra chances, unspoken rules, the habit of stepping back so he could step forward. I shook the memory loose and returned to the desk. I opened the lockbox again more carefully, this time, sorting through documents I hadn't looked at in years. Near the bottom, folded into a neat rectangle, was a form I recognized immediately. A financial power of attorney, my name at the top. A blank line where a signature should have been. I remembered filling it out after my husband died, back when everything felt fragile and temporary. I'd been advised to prepare for emergencies, to think ahead. I'd almost signed it, then convinced that trust was the same thing as love. But something had stopped me, a hesitation I couldn't explain at the time. I unfolded the paper and read it slowly. The language was absolute. Once activated, it would have given Ethan legal authority over everything I owned. I thought of the folder he'd brought, the tone of his voice, the way the pen had been placed within easy reach. I folded the paper in half, then in half again, and slipped it back into the lockbox. The decision felt final in a way I hadn't expected. Whatever version of trust I had, once imagined, no longer applied to the life I was living now. I closed the box, slid it back into the drawer, and reached for my phone, ready to start rearranging things quietly and for good. The next few days passed without drama, which suited me just fine. I started with the shared account. One phone call was enough. The representative confirmed the details, asked a few careful questions, and then closed it while I listened. No resistance, no argument, just procedure. When the line went quiet, something in my chest loosened. From there, I set new alerts on every account I still controlled. Deposits, withdrawals, any change, no matter how small. I chose the kind of notifications that arrived immediately, not hours later. I wanted to know in real time what happened to my money, the way I once knew the exact balance in my checkbook, down to the last dollar. Next came the trust. I went to a different branch than usual, one Ethan had never visited with me. The office was small, the carpet worn, the manager efficient, without being overly friendly. I moved my primary funds into a trust account and named my niece Simone as the beneficiary. She lived 2 states away, worked long hours, and had never once asked me for anything. When the papers were signed, I felt a steadiness settle in that I hadn't felt in years. That afternoon, I called the attorney listed on a flyer pinned to the bulletin board at the grocery store. Local, quiet, no promises of miracles. He listened while I explained the situation, asked only what mattered, and outlined exactly what steps I should take next. We reviewed my estate documents, updated them, removed assumptions I had made back when I believed certain relationships were permanent. Nothing about the process felt rushed. Nothing felt emotional. It was all clean lines and clear decisions. By the end of the week, every loose end was tied. Passwords changed, access revoked, records copied and filed. The house felt the same, but I didn't. I moved through the rooms with a new awareness, as if I'd reclaimed something invisible but essential. I didn't call Ethan. I didn't warn him. There was no need. The plan wasn't about confrontation. It was about protection. When Thursday came again, I set the table as usual, knowing that this time the evening would unfold very differently. Thursday came like clockwork. I cooked the same as always, nothing special, but enough. I set 2 plates, poured 2 glasses of water, and waited. But this time, the room wasn't the same. The dining table was gone. The sideboard, too. All that remained was a folding table I pulled from the garage and 2 plastic chairs I used when the plumber came. No centerpiece, no candles, no distractions. The walls were bare. I'd taken down the framed prints 2 nights before and boxed them quietly, sealing the lids with tape that didn't make a sound. I didn't want to feel sentimental. I wanted space. The front door opened without a knock. Ethan's voice carried into the hall ahead of him. "Smells like the usual," he said, before stepping into view and stopping. Clara came in behind him, her heels clicking twice before she paused, eyes scanning the stripped-down room. "What happened?" Ethan asked. I wiped my hands on a towel and turned toward them. "I've started simplifying," I said. Too much clutter. It was time. Neither of them spoke. Their eyes moved to the folding table, then back to me. "I made dinner," I added. "But before we sit, there's something I'd like you to review." I picked up the envelope from the counter and handed it to Ethan. He took it slowly, opening the flap without looking down. Inside were 2 documents. The first, a formal revocation of all pending financial authorizations, including anything unsigned or under review. The second, a typed notice that outlined the fraudulent activity found in my accounts, including the unauthorized transfers and credit applications. It stated that those actions had been reported, filed, time-stamped, and copied to the appropriate authorities. Ethan's face didn't change at first. Clara looked over his shoulder, then stepped back. "What is this?" he asked. "Documentation," I said. The room fell quiet, the kind of silence that made every clink of glass or shift of weight feel louder than it should. I turned back to the kitchen, lifted the pan from the stove, and placed it on the table like any other week. "You're welcome to eat," I said. I didn't look at their faces when I sat down. Ethan read the papers once, then again, faster the second time. His jaw tightened. His hands shook just enough for me to notice. "You're punishing us for trying to help," he snapped, slapping the envelope onto the table. "Is that what this is?" I looked at him calmly. "You took what wasn't offered." That was when his restraint disappeared. He pushed his chair back hard enough for it to scrape across the floor and stood pacing the length of the room that no longer held anything familiar to him. "After everything we've done," he said, "after all the times we came here, checked on you, made sure you were okay, this is how you repay us." I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I let the words exhaust themselves. Clara hadn't said a thing. She stood near the doorway, arms folded, eyes fixed on the floor. When Ethan turned to her for support, she didn't meet his gaze. That silence told me more than any confession could have. "You knew," I said quietly. Her head lifted just enough to confirm it, then dropped again. Ethan spun back toward me. "You're acting like we stole from you." "You did," I replied. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. For a moment, I thought he might say something else. Apologize. Explain. But instead, his face hardened into something I barely recognized. "You'll regret this," he said, "when you're alone. When you finally realize you pushed away the only family you had." I stood and gathered the plates, moving slowly, deliberately. My hands didn't tremble. I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. They left without touching the food. I followed them to the front door and watched as they crossed the driveway, rain beginning to fall in thin, uneven lines. Ethan opened the car door too hard. Clara slid in beside him without a word. The engine started reversed, and then they were gone. I stayed where I was long after the sound faded, listening to the rain settle into the quiet, aware that something had ended, and something else far quieter had begun. The days that followed did not rush past me. They moved at a slower pace one I hadn't noticed was possible until the noise was gone. On Saturday morning, I repotted the fern by the window. Its roots had grown tight against the plastic pot, pressing for space. I loosened the soil with my fingers, careful not to tear anything fragile, and set it into a larger container I'd had stored in the garage. The leaves lifted slightly, as if relieved. Later that afternoon, I tightened the loose hinge on the cabinet beneath the sink. It had been sagging for months. 5 minutes and a screwdriver were all it took. Simone came by on Sunday. She brought a small paper bag with muffins she'd baked herself, still warm enough to soften the butter. We sat at the folding table and talked about ordinary things. her commute, a neighbor's new dog, the kind of conversation that didn't need performance or explanation. She didn't ask about Ethan. I didn't offer. After she left, I noticed how the house sounded different. The quiet wasn't sharp anymore. It didn't echo. It settled. I moved through the rooms without bracing myself for interruptions, without anticipating someone else's appetite or mood. The space felt inhabited, just not crowded. Midweek, my lawyer called. His voice was even professional. He confirmed that all the appropriate accounts had been frozen and flagged. The unauthorized activity had been documented. Any access tied to Ethan's name had been revoked completely. Nothing can be moved without your direct approval, now he said. I thanked him and hung up, setting the phone back in its place. I stood by the window for a moment, watching the street as it went about its afternoon routines, and realized that for the first time in a long while, nothing was waiting for me to fix or defend or justify. That sense of calm followed me into the next morning when I woke, knowing the hardest part was already behind me. I sat by the window with a cup of plain tea resting between my hands. The steam rose and disappeared before it reached my face. Outside, the street moved the way it always had, cars passing, someone walking a dog, a delivery truck stopping 2 houses down. Nothing marked this day as different, except the way I felt inside it. The silence no longer asked anything of me. It didn't press. It didn't accuse. It simply existed, steady and unremarkable, and I realized how long it had been since I'd experienced quiet without waiting for it to be broken. My thoughts returned, not in a rush, but one at a time. I considered how easily authority had slipped into my son's voice, how naturally he had spoken, as if my life were a set of accounts to be organized, reduced, controlled. I thought about the moment concern stops sounding like care and starts sounding like instruction, then expectation, then entitlement. I thought about how many small permissions I had granted over the years, each one harmless on its own, until together they formed a habit I barely recognized. I remembered how normal it had all seemed while it was happening, how reasonable, how quietly it rearranged my place in my own home. I didn't search for answers. I had done enough searching. Some truths didn't need to be resolved to be understood. They only needed to be acknowledged and left where they were no longer carried forward as obligations. The tea cooled. I drank it anyway. There were things ahead of me now that required no defense and no explanation. Mornings that belonged to no one else's schedule. Evenings that ended when I chose to turn off the light. Decisions that didn't need consensus or approval. I rose from the chair, rinsed the cup, and placed it in the cabinet I'd fixed days earlier, aware that the questions would remain exactly where I left them, and that for the first time, they no longer defined what came next.